Professor Robert Clancy, thanks for your time.
It's a pleasure.
How did you get interested in maps?
I got interested in maps because I think I always collected things, and there was a time when suddenly I had all my exams behind me. I was living in Canada and I met a chap who had no wallpaper. He had maps on his wall, and I just fell in love with them.
What was it? Was it the look of the map, or was it the fact that what you're actually looking at means it's somewhere, it can take you somewhere?
Yeah, it's that. They look good, they are good, but most importantly they're the documents of history, and I've always liked history.
Talking of history, tell us about this first one here you've got.
Well, this is a great map. This is really the second or third map ever produced. It was the first one produced outside of Italy, produced in Ulm in Germany, and it reflects the old Ptolemaic ideas of what the world looked like.
And when are we talking about?
We're talking about coming out of the Middle Ages in 1482.
Wow.
And you can see that for the first time, new ideas were starting to appear. Up here, we can see Scandinavia and Greenland for the very first time. The Portuguese were starting to come down the west coast of Africa on the way to Australia, but we still had this great Antarctic continent giving a landlocked Indian Ocean, with Sri Lanka looking very large compared with India, which is pretty shrunken.
And no sign of us at this point? No sign of...
Well, no real sign of us, no.
No real sign. With these historic maps, is it the events, the stories of the events that you like, or is it the deeper story about humanity that comes out of these?
Well, I'm a scientist, so to me, they are the documents that record the evidence and what was thought of at the time. So it's the knowing about the history, about the times, and increasingly about the people of those times.
Because they also do say something about human qualities. I mean, this reflects exploration and therefore perseverance, courage, all those things are still universal.
Absolutely. It's the context of the maps that make them important.
So from this German map, what's this next one here?
Well, the next map is an interesting one, and it really starts talking about Australia, because this was made for the so-called Polyglot Bible, which Charles of Spain had asked it to be done and printed in the printing presses of Planten in Antwerp. So it was produced in Antwerp, but under the control of Spain, and of course in those days we're talking about 1570, Spain and Portugal. And we see in this map for the first time not just the biblical issues of the tribes of Abraham, but we also see 4 different languages, and we see a strange land where we now know northern part of Australia sits today, in a sea at a time when we were not supposed to be discovered. So those who believe Portugal discovered Australia think this is a very important map. And as most of them were lost at sea when they went from Antwerp back to Spain, there are very few copies of these available.
So where did you track down this copy?
I bought this in London, and I didn't know what it was, and fortunately the person selling it to me didn't know what it was. So we negotiated a ridiculous price to my advantage, and years later I found out what it was. I was reading a book and here was a picture of it. I said, good God, I have that map.
So you felt like it was discovery all over again.
Oh yes, absolutely.
And when you realised this hump here was the representation of Northern Australia, what was that like?
Well, many people have... This map now has become a very well-known map and a very popular map, although there are very few copies. And there's great argument as to what it really represents. The whole idea of Portuguese discovery of Australia, people retire and write books on their theories. So, it's far be it from me to have a humble view.
What are we looking at
Isn't
here?
that a beautiful map? Well, here, this is a map of 1660. And all these maps have original hand colour, because colour printing really didn't come in until the mid-1800s. And so you see, this was such an important part of the world for the Dutch. These are the Dutch Indies here. Each island seemed to have its own spice. Those spices then were the real reason the Dutch came, but for various reasons they had landfalls around 2/3, 3/4 of Australia. So when Cook discovered Australia, what is not well recognised by many school children is that most of Australia was known, and the only part that wasn't known is exactly where the east coast was.
Wow. These maps, on the one hand, we were talking before about the noble qualities that these maps reflect at the time, but nations went to war over maps.
Absolutely.
Or what the maps portrayed.
Absolutely, and this was the case with the Spanish and the Portuguese. They had a line that the Pope gave them. It was called the Line of Tordesillas, and it divided the unknown world between just Spain and just Portugal. And they kept moving this line, or paying money to have the line moved one way or the other, or having a war over where the line should be, depending on what particular new country lay there.
So what we're looking at is far more than just ink on paper then.
Oh yes, it is the document of what was happening, how the people thought, what they did, what they knew, what they thought they knew.
We have the history of Australia in maps that you've explored as well. You've done a book about it. What are we looking at here that tells us something about our country?
What I tried to do in this particular book was to take events that I thought were important in shaping the way we are today, particularly between 1850 and 1950, which is like a black hole, I think, for most people in history. We know about the pre-colonial time, we know about Captain Cook and the convicts, we know about post-World War II, and yet extraordinary changes came about in this country between 1850 and 1950. So I looked at events that helped shape Australia, and I took the documents, the maps of those events, and I suddenly discovered the men behind those events. And this particular map is a map of the Australian Agricultural Company, the land that was given to them by a company that was formed in England that was composed nearly entirely of politicians. So it was a very powerful company, and they gave 1 million acres. And unfortunately, they chose fairly unsuitable land for sheep, just north of Newcastle. To correct that, they sent a hard man, a chap who had been exploring in the Arctic called Parry, and gave him 5 years to sort out conditions. So he came out, took on the government, told them what was going to happen, and moved the Australian Agricultural Company from Newcastle up to around Tamworth. And he did it quite easily, because when the governor and Mitchell, the Surveyor General, said no way, he said, I'll just go back to my board. The board, of course, of the AA Company was all English politicians. And they said, of course Mr. Parry is right. Hence the change. But this is the original map that appeared in the first annual general meeting minutes of the AA Company in 1825.
You called your book Maps That Shaped Australia, but how much do you think maps, or even the lack of maps, shaped the attitude and characteristics of Australians?
Oh, I think they shaped the thought patterns of Australians and informed them enormously. If you look at nearly any book, this is a guide, a railway guide that was written, you'll find that at that time, nearly every book would have a map illustrating it. They may not have illustrations of people or places, but they would have a map, because people wanted to know where things were, and in those maps, of course, they would include so much more information. So the maps we see today, which are thematic maps or topographic maps, they're very specialised maps, although today I guess they all disappear because they're electronic maps. But these maps were compound maps. They contained all those information pieces in one form.
How have all these maps, collecting them, looking at them, changed your view of the world?
Well, I think it has. Not so much looking at the maps, but I like to use the maps. I like to write about them, I like to think about them, I like to talk about them. And in doing that, you have to look at the context of the maps. And in looking at the context of the maps, you really get a totally different picture of how the world evolved, how we evolved, how our lifestyle evolved. And I think this particular map of Antarctica demonstrates this, that I've always been interested in Antarctica. As a Boy Scout at 16, I was lucky enough to be chosen as one of 2 scouts to go to Antarctica, and I just fell in love with the place. And so I ended up collecting maps of Antarctica. And this map shows that in the late 1930s, when it was made, Australia had claimed 42% of Antarctica. And this was the very first claim map of the various countries claiming territories in Antarctica. And one of the 3 things that you have to do if you claim a territory is you have to map it. And so this became a very important cog. And so my whole concept of Antarctica changed as an example of how I saw the world, from a wonderful place with penguins and seals and icebergs and whatever, to a place of great international context and relating to the rest of the world and the frictions and tensions between the various peoples of the world.
In another big change, in this era where there are GPS devices, global positioning systems,
Absolutely.
replacing in some ways the map, in your heart, can they really ever replace the map?
Of course not. But having said that, they do, because what's being asked of maps now is very different to what was being asked of maps in 1930. In 1930, this was a very important document. It stated, we in Australia, this is an official map, we in Australia claim 42% of Antarctica. Now, that would be done in a very different way. The maps today are really electronic. They position all the other things that are going on, the imaging from space, whereabouts are we actually looking at the movements of ice flow, krill passage in the Antarctic Ocean, and the maps really give the background context for that. So it's a very different reason for using maps.
So that wonderful thing we all do as kids, where we sit there with an atlas and we flick to a country and we dream, one day I'd love to go there. That's almost going to be a thing of the past, is it?
Well, you find, I'm not sure, you're too young to have grandchildren, Scott, but I have them, and my 5-year-old and 6-year-old grandchildren come here, turn on the computer and whip up everything they want. Their concept of maps is already different. They can create the map, they can merge the maps, they can put things on maps. And so maps to them already is a very different thing, and that's what they want. They don't want bits of paper.
Does that change our worldview, do you think? Do you think in time that means humanity's interaction with the world, or at least how we view it, will change?
I think so. I think people, firstly, they're going to get a much more international view than I certainly had when I was very young. Secondly, they're going to see a very different form of world. They're going to see it through very technical eyes, and without maybe some of the humanity, I think, that I find comes through in some of these very early maps.
It's been a fascinating journey through your maps. Professor Robert Clancy, thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Scott.